Hello everyone, I'm the pro poker player with the accent, and in this video I'll walk you through the key hands from this session in Los Angeles, explaining the reasoning behind every decision. Big pots, tricky spots, and hands that really tested my strategy. Blinds are 5-5 and I'm sitting with about $1,000. In this first hand, I'm on the bottom with Jack-9 of spades and I call an opponent's $20 bet. When we are on the bottom, sometimes it's not so necessary to raise, and this is a hand that plays well calling. The flop comes 3 low cards, deuce, 3-5, and of different suits, a rainbow flop. Both opponents in the hand check and I do too. I have nothing, and for now I'm not going to bluff this hand. I'll wait to see what my opponents do on the turn, and then we will see. The turn is the 7 of spades, which gives me a flush draw. The first opponent bets $45, the other folds, and I call. The river is the 8 of hearts. This time the player checks, and here I have to bet strongly if I want to knock my opponent out of a 7 he may have. I bet $130, which is practically the size of the pot, and after thinking for a while he folds, and the bluff works. That 8 is a good card for me since it's higher than the 7 and I have many more 8s in my range, including some 2-pair. It's a risky bet, but it paid off. In this hand, I bet 20 on MP1 and 3 opponents call. We are therefore playing the hand in a multi-way pot. The flop comes ace, queen 7, rainbow with no hearts. We hit top pair and I make a continuation bet of $30. I could check here, but I prefer to bet this ace and check on the turn. The 3 opponents don't want to leave this hand and call. The turn is the 6 of clubs and everyone checks. I can't continue betting my ace here since my kicker is quite bad and I'm playing against several players, one of whom is likely to have an ace with a better kicker than mine. The river is the 9 of spades. One opponent bets 100, another calls, and I decide to fold. The reason I fold is because the second player calls. Against one player, my ace with a 7 kicker might be good sometimes, but against 2, it's very likely that one of them will have a better hand than mine. Sure enough, they both show the same hand, an ace with a 9 kicker, and I fold wisely, saving myself $100 to pay for my hotel room. When you have a weak kicker, you have to be careful and analyze the hand. An ace 7, even though it might seem like a good hand, isn't always so in many situations. I look at the 2 cards I've been dealt and I see a premium hand. This one is one of the best pre-flop hands in poker. I have ace king of diamonds. 2 players limp to 5, an opponent in the cutoff bets to 25, and I raise to 75. The 2 players who limped fall, and the player who bet first call. The flop is 7, 9, 10 rainbow. A bad flop for my hand since there are no diamonds, and therefore I don't have a backdoor flush. This means that with 2 diamonds, if a card on the flop is a diamond, I could make a flush if 2 more diamonds appear on the turn and the river. This board of 7, 9, 10 favors my opponent range, and for that reason I decide not to bet and check. My opponent does the same and the turn is a 6, completing a possible straight. If a player had an 8, they would have a straight. However, both players check again, the river is a 5, this time my opponent bets 55 and I have to decide whether to call with my ace high or fold. I know my opponent doesn't have an 8 because he would have bet it on the turn, so his bet represents a hand like 2-pair or something similar. However, my opponent could have a hand like Jack-Queen, King-Queen, Ace-Jack, Ace-10, etc. I decide to call and I catch him in the bluff. A player in UTG, the first position to act, bets $15. I call with my Jack-Queen of diamonds since his range in UTG is very strong. When in UTG, we should only open with our strongest hands. Another player also calls and the player in the big blind raises to 75. The UTG player folds and I call. This isn't something you should do often, as I've called an opponent's open and then call another raise. Here I'm capping my range and playing my hand passively, which is something we don't want to do. However, I have position on my opponent since he is in the big blind and I decide to call his raise. The flop comes a 7, an 8 and a 10 with 2 hearts and a diamond. A good flop for me. The opponent bets 75 and it's very likely I'm facing an overpair. Here I decide to call and see what comes on the turn. The card that comes out is the 6 of spades. A great card for me since it completes a straight to a 9. The opposing player checks and here I have to get aggressive and bet to try and make him fold. I bet $200 into a $300 pot, which I think is the bet that will make him fold. Anyway, my intention if the villain doesn't fall is to go all in on the river and finally make him fold that overpair he seems to have. It's not necessary because the player, after thinking about it for a long time, folds his hand and I win this pot with absolutely nothing. This time I'm dealt king, queen and I open 230. Only one player calls, so we are going to play this hand heads up. The flop is good and gives me top pair with queen, 9, 5 rainbow. I make a continuation bet of $35 and my opponent calls. He could have many hands here, from a straight draw with jack 10 to a worse queen than mine like queen jack or queen 10. The turn is the 6 of clubs. And I'm going to continue betting for value. The player is a low-level player and I think he can keep calling me with many worse hands. I also want to extract value from any potential draw he might have. That's why I bet $120 and he calls again. The river is the ace of hearts and I decide to check so that if my opponent has missed the draw, he will bluff. That's what he does. He bets quite big to $300. Now I have to decide whether to call or not. My first instinct was to call since his jack 10 draws have missed, and that is a bluff he might have. However, he doesn't have many other bluffs and he has several strong hands, such as a 2 pair he could have made on the river or a set he had on the flop and was passively playing. In the end, I decided to call and my opponent showed a set of 9s and I lost this hand. If the river had been, for example, an 8, I would have folded because that 8 would have completed a jack 10 for a straight and my opponent wouldn't have had any bluffs, making my fold easier. This time I have a 9 of the same suit and they are diamonds. I am in MP1 and I bet $20. 2 players enter the pot and call. The flop is king 8-6 with 2 spades. Here I'm going to bet for protection. I have a second pair that I want to bet because I don't want to leave the turn for free and the other players to connect with their cards they might have. I bet $20 and only one of them calls. The turn is the 5 of hearts and we both check. Once I bet the flop, I shouldn't continue betting the turn since he might have a king. The river is the 8 of hearts. He decides to bet only $20. If he had a flush, he would have bet much bigger, which is why I decide to raise to $120. It's very likely my opponent has the king, and with this bet, I'm representing the flush or the 8 that gave me a set. However, my opponent might think I'm bluffing because if I had the flush, I should have bet it maybe on the turn. That's why I think the villain finally called and obviously we win the hand. He told me he did indeed have a king. In the next hand I'm dealt queens. One player opens 220 and I raise 265. Other player calls and the first opener also calls. The flop is 10-7-5 with 2 clubs. I make a continuation bet of half of the pot for $100. When there are draws on the flop, it's good to bet half of the pot, and in this case, there are 2 clubs and many possible straight draws. It's a very wet board. This means there are many possible draws. The opposite would be a dry board, such as a flop of queen 7 deuce. Going back to the hand, one of my opponents raises to $220 and the other opponent raises all in. Here I'm in a difficult spot because that board is close to my opponent's ranges and it's likely they have a set. Furthermore, both opponents have re-raised, which is why I decide to fold. Against one opponent I would have called, but when there are 2 re-raises, it's better to fold this time. The player who raised first showed 10-10 for a set, and the one who went all in only had jack 10. A very bad player who shouldn't have done that with that hand. In any case, it was a good fold on my part since the other player had the best possible hand with the set of tens. In this hand I have a 10 and an 8 of different suits. I decide to limp to 5 from the bottom and the small blind raises to 25. A player calls and since I have position on both, I decide to call as well. The flop is great, 9, Jack, Queen. I flop a straight, but the second possible one, since King 10 would beat me. 2 spades also on the flop. The player who raised pre-flop now bets 25. The other player calls and I raise to 100. The pre-flop aggressor falls, but the other player calls. The turn is the King of Clubs. This card is bad for me since it makes the straight very obvious, just one card away. However, my opponent might have a flush draw with the spades, so I decide to continue betting my hand, going for $120, and he calls. The river is the 9 of Clubs. Another bad card since it pairs the board and now my opponent can beat me with a full house if he had 2 pairs before. However, he checks and I bet, so he might call me with King-Queen type of hand. I bet $275, but the villain falls and says he had 6-3 of spades. That means he had a flush draw. I now have kings on the bottom. This hand has a straddle, which is posting 1 blind more than double the big blind. So now there are a $2 blind, a $5 blind, and an additional $10 blind. 2 players limp in and I bet 55. Only one of them calls the same one as in the previous hand. The flop comes King, Queen 10, Rainbow. I make a continuation bet of $65 with my set of kings and my opponent calls. Here he might have a pair plus a straight draw like Queen Jack or 10 Jack. The turn is an 8 and I bet again, this time 175, and he calls again. The river is a 7, which is irrelevant to this hand, and he bets $300. At this point, I obviously know I am going to call. My only thought is whether to raise or not. I decide to just call because if I raise, he will just call me with a straight and fold the worst hand that I am beating. I pay and he shows ace-deuce for a bluff. I'm dealt pocket tens and the straddle is on. I bet $30 and 2 opponents call. The flop is 7-5-5 Rainbow and I make a continuation bet of half of the pot, $45. Here I want to extract value from 7x, 8s or 9s that villains may have, or even an ace high that might want to see the turn. I also need to protect my top pair in case the turn brings a card higher than my tens. Only one of the players calls. The turn is the 7 of spades. A very bad card for me since the villain can now beat me if he has a 5 or a 7. I check and he bets $105. I decide to call and see what he does on the rear. Depending on what he does on the river, I will either fold or not. The river is the deuce of clubs, which is a blank. This means it has no effect on the hand. The villain bets $150 and this is where I start to think. His bet is quite small and he's only betting 1/3 of the pot, and this seems likely a bet to get me to call. However, betting such a small amount means I only have to win 1 out of every 4 times for my call to be profitable in the long run. Because of this, and because some straight draws have missed, I decide to call and the player says, "You good, I miss, you win." As I was packing up to leave, I was dealt queens again. The straddle was at 10 and I opened to $30. 2 players called and the flop came an ace, a 6 and a 5 of different suits. We'll check the flop. I don't need to bet because my queens don't need protection because the only card that is higher than my queens is the king, as the ace was already on the board. If I had, for example, 6-7, I would have bet my 6 for protection to avoid giving the villain a free turn and letting them connect with their cards. In any case, the turn was a 5 and I decided to start betting my hand for value now. I bet $45 and both opponents called. The rear was a deuce and I checked. I did this hoping they would bet a miss straight they might have. However, both opponents checked and I won the hand with my queens. Here I probably should have value bet my queens against to get called, with a 6 or some middle pair like 8-8 or 7-7 that they might have. In any case, after this hand I collected my chips and went back to the hotel. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, hype and like this video, and I'll see you in the next one.